Most people read straight past it. They are hurrying to get to the famous part, the three questions: do you love me? Feed my sheep. And to reach that conversation, they have to walk right through a detail so ordinary it barely registers. Before any of the talking happens, the risen Son of God is crouched on a beach at dawn, building a fire and cooking fish. Stop there for a second because it is genuinely strange. This is the morning after the most consequential event in human history. Death has just been defeated. The tomb is empty. The person doing the cooking has, by his own account and theirs, conquered the grave. And what he chooses to do with that morning, the very first thing he does for his friends after rising from the dead, is make them breakfast. Not summon them to a mountain. Not appear in glory. Not deliver a discourse on what has just happened to the universe. He gets a fire going. He grills some fish. He warms some bread, and he calls a group of exhausted, embarrassed men over to eat. We are so used to the story that the oddity slides right past us. But if you had to guess in advance how the risen Lord would spend his first recorded morning decooking breakfast, would not have made the list. It is too small, too domestic, too much like something your grandmother would do, and not at all like something the conqueror of death would do. Which is exactly why it is worth stopping on. Because John, who wrote this, does not waste details, and he is the most deliberate word chooser of all the gospel writers. When he lingers on a fire and a fish and a breakfast, he is not filling space before the real scene. The breakfast is the real scene. And hidden in one single word he uses for that fire is a detail that turns the whole morning from a quaint domestic footnote into one of the most tender, deliberate things Jesus ever did. Let's walk down to the beach. To feel the weight of the morning, you have to know what the men on that beach had just been through, and what they were doing there in the first place. It is a few days after the resurrection, and Peter, the one who had sworn he would die before he denied his Lord, and had then denied him 3 times before a rooster finished crowing, Peter announces he is going fishing. The others go with him. It is easy to read that as a casual detail, but it is not casual. Fishing was the life Peter had before Jesus called him. It was the thing he knew how to do, the thing he could control, the trade he could go back to when everything else had come apart. There is a quiet defeat in it. The man who had walked on water and been called the Rock is back in the boat, back at the nets, back to the old life, as if the last 3 years had run into the sand. And the fishing fails. They work all night, the good hours for it, and catch nothing. Empty nets at dawn on the very lake where this whole thing had begun. It is hard not to see the shape of it. The return to the old life doesn't even work anymore. He couldn't hold on to his faith on the night of the fire, and now he can't even catch a fish. Then, in the gray light, there is a figure on the shore. They don't recognize him. He calls out and asks if they have caught anything. No, they admit. Cast on the other side, he says. They do, and the net fills so suddenly and so heavily they can barely drag it. And John, always the first to see, says quietly, "It is the Lord." And Peter, who is nothing if not wholehearted even in his mess, throws himself into the water and swims for shore ahead of the boat. So picture what he is swimming toward: the man he denied, the face he last saw across a courtyard. He does not yet know what he is going to get when he reaches the sand: a reckoning, a rebuke, a cold silence. He only knows he cannot stay in the boat, and what is waiting for him when he drags himself up onto the beach, dripping and ashamed, is a fire and a breakfast. Here is the first thing worth noticing, before we get to the word that changes everything. When they reach the shore, the fire is already burning, the fish is already on it, there is already bread. Jesus does ask them to bring some of the fish they have just caught. He folds their catch into the meal, which is its own small kindness, letting them contribute to a breakfast that did not need them. But the breakfast was already made. He did not wait for their fish. He did not need their success. Before they had landed a thing, before Peter had said a word, the food was ready and the fire was lit. The provision came first, and it came from him. There is a whole disposition of God folded into that small fact. He fed them before they produced anything. The net had just failed all night. Their competence had come to nothing. And none of that changed what was waiting on the beach. The fire was not a reward for the catch. It was there before the catch. Grace tends to arrive in that order, ready before you are, lit before you have earned the warmth. But the fire itself is where John does the thing that most people miss entirely. Because of the word he chose to describe it, the Greek word John uses for that fire is anthrakia. It means specifically a fire of burning coals, a charcoal fire. It is where we get our word anthracite, the hard coal that burns hot and low. And this word, anthrakia, is not a common one. In the entire New Testament, all of it, every book, it appears exactly twice. Once here, on this beach, at this breakfast, and once before, in the same gospel written by the same hand. In John chapter 18, on the night Jesus was arrested, Peter stands in the courtyard of the high priest waiting to see what will happen to his Lord. And it is cold. So he stands with the guards and the servants warming his hands at a fire. John tells you exactly what kind of fire. A charcoal fire, an anthraka. And it is standing at that fire in its light and its warmth that Peter is asked 3 times whether he knows the man Aj, and 3 times says he does not. 2 charcoal fires, the only 2 in the whole New Testament. One in a courtyard where Peter denied he had ever known Jesus, one on a beach where the risen Jesus is about to ask him 3 times whether he loves him. And the same rare word ties them together, deliberately placed there by the one writer who was standing near enough on both nights to remember the smell. Because that is what a charcoal fire is. It is not only light and heat, it is a smell. Distinct, unmistakable, the particular scent of coals burning low. And smell of all the senses is the one most fused to memory. It bypasses thought entirely and drops you, whole, back into a moment you had tried to leave behind. When Peter came up out of the water and caught the scent of that fire on the beach, some part of him would have been standing in the courtyard again, in the worst moment of his life, watching himself fail. Jesus rebuilt the fire on purpose. He recreated with quiet precision the exact sensory setting of Peter's denial, and then set breakfast on it. The instinct is to flinch at that. It sounds at first almost cruel. To reconstruct the scene of a man's deepest shame and make him stand in it again. But watch what Jesus actually does inside that reconstructed scene, because it is the opposite of cruelty. He does not bring up the denial. He does not replay it, or name it, or extract an apology for it. He asks a different question 3 times, one for each denial. Do you love me? And each time he hears a yes, he hands Peter back a piece of his calling. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The man who had unsaid his loyalty 3 times at a charcoal fire is given 3 chances to say it again at another charcoal fire, and is not merely forgiven but recommissioned, handed responsibility, trusted with the flock. This is the thing about how Jesus restores, and it is worth sitting with because it runs against every instinct we have. He does not heal Peter by helping him avoid the memory. He does not relocate the healing to a safe, neutral place with no associations. He walks him straight back into the exact scene of the failure, the same smell, the same low fire, the same early morning cold, and he redeems it from the inside. He does not erase the courtyard. He builds a second fire and gives the memory a new ending. There is a mercy in that which a simple pardon could never accomplish. Because after this morning, the smell of a charcoal fire would never again belong only to the worst night of Peter's life. It would belong just as much to the morning his Lord made him breakfast and gave him back the flock. The same scent that had been a wound was made deliberately into a place of healing. That is not something you do by forgetting. It is something you do by returning with the right person beside you. Step back, though, from the fire itself to the plain fact of the meal, because there is a pattern here older than this beach. When the risen Christ wanted to restore his people, he did it with food. And that is not a one-off. Read backward through the story, and you keep finding God meeting people at meals. In the wilderness, he does not lecture a hungry, faithless nation into trust. He sends bread on the ground every morning, manna, enough for the day. On the last night before the cross, when Jesus wants to give the disciples something to hold on to, he does not write them a creed. He hands them bread in a cup and says, "Remember me with this." And just days before this breakfast, on the road to Emmaus, two disciples walk for miles beside the risen Jesus without recognizing him. And the moment their eyes are finally opened, the hinge of the whole scene is when he takes bread and breaks it and gives it to them. He was known, Luke says, in the breaking of the bread. There is something about a shared meal that God keeps returning to, as if it carries a weight that words alone cannot. A meal is not an argument, it is a nearness. It says, without saying anything, that the distance is closed, that you are welcome at the table, that whatever happened, we are eating together now. When the risen Lord cooks fish on a beach, he is doing the most characteristic thing God does in Scripture. He is feeding the people he loves because that is how he has always drawn near, and he does it with his own hands. That is the part that should never quite lose its strangeness. This is the same person John opened his gospel by calling the Word, the one through whom everything that exists was made. The one who, a few mornings earlier, walked out of a sealed tomb under his own power. Every reason to expect distance, ceremony, glory. And instead, he is crouched over coals, turning fish so they don't burn, warming bread, doing the small, unglamorous work of getting a breakfast onto a plate for tired men. The hands that had made the sea were grilling fish caught out of it. We tend to think greatness would hold itself above a task like that the truly exalted have people for such things. And the risen Christ, at the peak of the most triumphant moment imaginable, gets down in the sand and cooks. It is the same downward motion that runs through the whole story. The God who washes feet, who is born in a manger, who rides a borrowed colt, showing up one more time on a beach in an apron of smoke. His glory has never once been the kind that refuses to serve. It has always been exactly the kind that kneels by a fire and says, "Come and eat." Now let me be fair, because a careful person should be testing this by now, and honesty is the point of a study like this. Am I certain the charcoal fire was meant to recall the denial? Strictly, no. And I want to be clear about that. John never says it. He does not write, and Peter remembered the other fire. He never spells the connection out. Someone could argue the repeated word is a coincidence, that a charcoal fire is simply what you would cook over, and that I am building a cathedral on a single vocabulary choice. So here is what is actually solid underneath the interpretation. The word anthrakia genuinely does appear only twice in the entire New Testament, and both times are in John, and both times it is Peter standing at the fire. That is not my invention, that is countable fact. And John, of all the gospel writers, is the one who most consistently chooses his words to carry more than their surface. The one who builds his whole book on double meanings and deliberate echoes. A rare word repeated by a careful author, at two scenes featuring the same man and the same theme of denial and love. That is a pattern worth trusting, even if John, in his usual restraint, leaves you to notice it yourself rather than pointing at it. He rarely points. He tends to lay the detail down quietly and trust the reader to feel the weight. I think the echo is real, but you are hearing exactly where the certainty ends and the reading begins, And that is how it should be. The breakfast, at least, needs no interpretation at all. That part is simply on the page. The risen Lord made his friends a meal. Quick word before the last turn. If this is the kind of study that makes the Bible feel deeper without making it more complicated, subscribing genuinely helps these keep going. So, come off the beach, because this is where the fire has your name on it. Most of us, when we have failed badly, want the same thing, distance. We want to get as far as possible from the scene of it, to never smell that particular smoke again, to rebuild our lives somewhere the memory can't reach. And we quietly assume that God wants that too. That the path back to Him runs away from the failure, through enough time and enough distance that the whole thing can finally be forgotten. We expect, if we ever have to face Him about it, a reckoning, a cold fire, an accounting. And the beach says something else entirely. It says, the risen Christ does not restore you by helping you flee the scene of your worst morning. He restores you by meeting you in it. He builds a fire on the very spot you are most ashamed of. And instead of a reckoning, there is breakfast. Instead of the question you are dreading, how could you have done that? There is a different question. Do you love me? And every time you manage a yes, He hands you back something you thought you had forfeited for good. You are, in this story, Peter. Dripping, ashamed, swimming toward the one you let down, braced for the worst. And what is waiting is a meal he made with his own hands, on a fire that was burning before you got there. You do not have to earn your way back to the table. The food was ready before your net came up empty. He is not standing on the shore with his arms crossed, waiting to see if you are sorry enough. He is crouched over the coals, asking if you have had anything to eat. And notice, one more time, that the fire was already lit. That is the whole comfort of it. Your restoration was prepared before you arrived, before you performed, before you got a single thing right. You are not asked to build the fire. You are asked to come and eat at the one already burning. So, the smallest, most domestic detail in the whole resurrection turns out to be the most tender. The risen Lord of the universe spent his first morning back cooking breakfast for the men who had run and rebuilding on purpose the exact fire where the worst of them had failed, so he could give that fire a new meaning and give the man a new start. He did not summon Peter to a throne. He called him to a table. That is how he still comes. Not to the scene of your success where you would expect him. To the scene of your failure, where you least do, with a fire already lit, and something already cooking, and a place at the meal that was yours before you swam ashore. Come and have breakfast. If this opened this morning up for you, tell me in the comments what you had always pictured when you thought of the risen Jesus. Subscribe so the next study finds you, and pass this to one person who has been trying to outrun the smell of an old fire. And may the God who meets you at the fire you are most afraid of keep you warm at his table all this week.